Friends, I'll quickly introduce the panel. My name is Biraj Patnaik. I'm with the National Foundation for India, and we are very happy, as I said in the morning, to be able to work with Land Conflict Watch on this report, which really looks at and Anmol will take us through it, but the different High Court judgments as well as the state legislation that have come in after Jaspal Singh. And what is the interface between the two? Has it been helpful? Has it been not? Does it really advance the cause of commons from the lens of the marginalized who are most impacted by it? So I want to, because we'll have a hard stop, we have been given 15 minutes by Habitat as a leeway to extend this. So we're going to keep it very brief. I'll request the panelists to be very brief. I'm just changing the format slightly. Instead of talking generically on the commons, there'll be a set of pointed questions that I would want the panelists to respond to. Let me quickly introduce the panel before bringing Anmol in. On my left is Sister Sneha Gill. Sister Sneha is from Jammu, and she's here representing the National Dalit Christian Watch. Vincent Manoharan was also to join us today but couldn't for various reasons. And Sister Sneha is a well-known Dalit land rights activist, has been part of many movements, is part of the Delhi, till recently she was part of the Minority Commission of the Delhi government, and she's also been a practicing lawyer in all courts in Delhi. We have Nikita Sud, who joins us online. Professor Nikita Sud is a professor of politics and development in the University of Oxford. She's been really looking at the interface of neoliberalism and transformation of state and governance in the global south. Widely studied, researched, and written extensively on India. Her latest book being The Making of Land and the Making of India, published by OUP in 2021. We next have, and I speak in the order that speakers are sitting on the stage, we have Pranab. Pranab is the founder for Center for Land Governance. He's been working on natural resource management and governance over the last 25 years. He's perhaps the only panelist today who's worked with government. He started his career with the Indian Council for Agriculture Research. And since then, he's been an independent researcher, a practitioner. And the Center for Land Governance that he founded in 2015 is now essentially doing a lot of action and policy research on the issue of land tenure. We have Rakshita. Rakshita is a very well-known right to information and NREGA activist. She's the second panelist here who's worked with government. She was in the Ministry of Rural Development for a few years, steering the MGNREGA program. She's been responsible for the lobbying, the advocacy, the drafting of the NREGA back in the day, between 2004 and 2014. She currently is the founder director of the Social Accountability Forum for Action and Research, SAFAR. And the big ticket item, which isn't mentioned in the bio, but I thought I should say that because Rakshita is here, that they're working on now, is really to push for an accountability law across the country at the central and at the state level. So that's something that she's working on now. And last but not the least, we have Tushar, who's an independent forest rights researcher. And I'm very keen to hear from Tushar, also because when we speak about commons today, we haven't touched really very deeply on the issue of forest rights and commons and how it works. So I'll bring you on that. He's again someone who's been part of the various civil society initiatives on FRA, not just as a researcher of forest rights and governance, but also as an activist and somebody who's very well known both in government and civil society circles. He's been doing trainings and workshops for all of us for civil society over the years, but also for Ministry of Tribal Affairs, the forest departments across the country, and so on. So welcome to a very, very distinguished panel. So let me just start straight with Nikita because she's online. I'm not going to take any bandwidth talking about the study or the problems of the commons that confront us post Jaspal Singh, and dive straight into the panel because of the time constraints we have. But I mean, it strikes me because better part of my working life, I've been involved with a similar omnibus case, in fact, the right to food case, which was the largest continuing mandamus perhaps on socioeconomic rights anywhere in the world. And one saw over 20 years, the transformative sort of impact it had leading up to the National Food Security Act legislation. But when we look at what has happened in this omnibus order, Nikita, it's quite clear that the results are ambiguous from Jagpal Singh. We don't have the kind of results that one would have expected that an order that purportedly was passed to protect commons would deliver. So could we have expected more from judicial intervention, or is this the limits of judicial intervention, given the times that we are in? And, it's 40 years of neoliberalism in a sense. So we've moved very far right now as a society and so on. So a question to you, given the fact that you've studied this extensively, also because you're familiar and you worked on the larger societal forces that are gripping India now. So if you could just speak to that.
Thank you for inviting me to the organizers and to Biraj for posing this interesting question. I think I'll use my place as an academic to maybe broaden the question just a bit, because I think it is very relevant to the excellent report that was just presented very, very nicely. I want to begin by talking about, why the commons matter at all, where they come from. And really all land at some point or the other has been common land. The idea of property and land as a commodity that belongs to one person or even to the state is a very new idea looking at the span of human history. And it really is about the state investing its authority and space on land, and saying that this land is now, to be commodified, titled, handed over to private individuals or made into state land or given over to industry to build railways or whatever. So this is a very new idea. And I think what you're saying is, are there larger forces at play? Yes, of course, commodifying land, liberalizing land, privatizing it more and more. Or as one of my interviewees in my land research said, enough talk about land reform and land from the rich to the poor. What neoliberal India really needs is land from the poor to the rich, because we are the ones who create value. And I just wanted to take a step back from that and say, this kind of uncommoning of land, of privatizing land, has been going on at least for 200 years. And liberalization accelerates that. Commons are seen as waste, as unproductive, and the state really wants to ally with parties, whether it's private, industrialists, the rich, the middle class, richer farmers, etc., who it sees as more productive. Which is why, while Jagpal Singh's judgment is very progressive, what we see often on the ground, as your report also made clear, is just the opposite, because the state decides that these are the productive sections of society that it would rather ally with to create value on the land and in the economy. And as a counter, the report, you pose the question, what do we do? What can one do when those are the trends? Historically, 200 years ago, colonial state onwards, and accelerating now in the period of liberalization. And I wanted to quote from Milan Kundera, the Czech author, who said the struggle of man, although let's expand it to humans, the struggle of humans against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. And I think there is something to be said for thinking of the commons as how land really has been and ought to be, whether it's forest land or, city land, pavements, parks, or rural land. The memory that we must go on kindling rather than forgetting is how the commons is the main, how land ought to be, and privatization and narrowing of the base of who owns and controls land is very recent and not at all the norm or regular or to be taken for granted. And this is not just an academic idea. I cite, for instance, a group of fish workers in Chennai who work with, the Coastal Resource Center, the other media, who are trying mapping exercises to show how land that is being taken over for power stations, for a port and special economic zone is actually land that produces cultural value. So it is, there in their poetry, their festivals, etc. It is, of course, of economic value. That is where their fish catch is dried. That's where their boats are kept. So this exercise of rekindling memory of value, not just value that is neoliberal and goes into GDPs and is obvious, but much broader value, cultural, environmental, economic. I think that's very, very important. And that's why even when I wrote a review of the Land Conflict Watch report, I highlighted that we must have these life stories of the everyday, of the commons, of everyday people to bring alive the wonderfully rich data that you collect. And I just want to end by talking about the urban commons. We've had some very invigorating movements in today's restricted politics of India. And here I'm thinking about the anti-CAA movement and the farmers movement, which was more recent. Each of those have been about taking over the commons, the urban commons, very visibly, which was all over the media. So things like, the Shaheen Bagh sit-ins, farmers camping outside Delhi, taking over streets in Punjab. Those are assertions of our right to space and common land that then seeps into politics and assertions over the nation. So this struggle for memory over forgetting goes well beyond so-called encroachment over of a house over common land, etc. It is asserting a right to space and to be there on land as citizens and as people to whom the commons and all land should belong. And in the interest of time, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Nikita, for that reminder. And I'll take the reverse order. Tushar, I'll start with you first. The battle of memory against forgetting. The only living memory we have of land as a common resource where the state doesn't have the principle of eminent domain today is perhaps most widely in the Northeast and a few isolated pockets elsewhere where community lands are still owned. And the forest communities of India are the ones who are perhaps the closest to the memory of having had common lands, And so when you look at the FRA, do you think that the FRA really represents that ideal governance regime for commons? Would you look at it that way? Do you think we can, particularly the community forest rights, do CFR bring us closer to memory rather than forgetting in this battle that we have, bring us closer to a fruition of getting back lands as common resources? And what do you see are the challenges that FRA poses in this ideal situation?
Thank you for the opportunity. One major change that we see in Forest Right Act and we, in the 15 years of Forest Right Act implementation, something which is relevant for this discussion on the problems that we see on commons is the idea of community forest resource itself. Because, as we discuss, the origin of the problem is the way commons have been constructed, the construction of commons, classification of commons. And at least insofar as the forest land is concerned, Now, Forest Right Act brings this clarity that community forest resources are new categories of forest, and it very clearly says Forest Right Act, and if you read the guideline, it very clearly says that community forest resources constitute a new category, legal category of forest, which include all kind of forest, including reserve forest, protected forest, national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, and tiger reserves. So, I mean, the way the colonial governments framed uh, the fiction of forest, the idea of forest, and the way that led to the historical injustice process, the origin and classification of forest. Forest Right Act tries to undo that with this very strong and powerful concept of community forest resources. Now, in one of our study, which we try to look at what is the minimum potential of this the Forest Right Act and Community Forest Resource Rights recognition in India, and we found this is based on government information that at least if Forest Right Act is fully implemented, at least 40 to 50 million hectares of forest in India, which is almost more than 50% of the notified forest in India, can be designated as community forest resource right. And on that, if you look at Forest Right Act and the structure of Forest Right Act, Gram Sabhas can do a lot of things in terms of managing those commons. There is recognition and vesting of rights. Those commons can be protected against extraction. So there is protection of the community forest resources. And importantly, Gram Sabhas can establish governance, their own governance and management over the community forest resources. This is legally and theoretically, this is possible. And practically, we have seen last 15 years, although the Forest Right Act implementation is limited, but wherever Forest Right Act has been implemented, and people have got community forest resource right, we have seen those ideas of commons and use of commons and governance of commons expanding, like in Maharashtra, in Odisha, and many other parts. We see those practical possibilities of generating employment, generating livelihoods, strengthening governance. All that is happening. So, I mean, and this idea of community forest resources, I think logically should now be extended to other commons. And we have an opportunity because in many states which are the fifth schedule state, PESA rules are now getting implemented. And one of the minimum thing which can be which can be explored in PESA and with PESA rules is to extend the same idea of Forest Rights Act, the same idea of community forest rights, community forest resources, to record all other commons. That is quite possible, and that as a policy that should be pursued. Now, what are the challenges? I would just flag a few challenges. One major challenge of why we are seeing conflict is because the Forest Right Act is not implemented. We have already highlighted. And recently, LCW has, colleagues in LCW have published a report which show large-scale wrongful rejection of claims. Supreme Court in 2019 asked for a review of all wrongful rejections, but two years down the line, there is this study based on the RTI information. In Madhya Pradesh alone, more than 2 lakh claims have been again illegally rejected without any hearing in the Gram Sabha by using a web-based application, which is based on satellite and that kind of information. So, large-scale rejection of claims, large-scale rejection of the idea of Forest Right Act, non-implementation of Forest Right Act, I think that is a source of conflict. The other major source of conflict that we see, there is a good compilation of the number of circulars, orders, guidelines that have been issued by the Environment Ministry post Forest Right Act. And if you look at all those guidelines, circulars, executive instruction, those are actually the source of creation of conflicts. Like, for example, one guideline says that for CAMPA, implementation of CAMPA, the state governments are, the state forest departments have to identify land banks. And it says that these land banks can be identified from revenue forest land, from Nistari Jungle, from Chote Jhad Ka Jungle. And so if you relate that itself, that is a source of that creates the source of conflict. So I think as a way, forward, as we see, I mean, it is necessary, one, as part of the LCW process, to see how these laws are creating laws and guidelines at the present moment, including the new forest conservation rules, are creating conflicts, are source of conflicts, and how they are likely to create more conflicts. I mean, this is something which has to be brought out very loudly.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I stop at that.
Thanks, Tushar. In fact, the granularity of these conflicts, which could potentially be created by the FRA, stem also from the fact that there is no cultural understanding of land use by communities. So you are having areas being marked out under CFR for one community, even though it's used by multiple communities for specific products. I may go as part of a festival to collect one flower from one plot, which tomorrow my usufruct rights to that plot could get impacted by CFR. And you talk about PESA. NFI has just commissioned and completed a review of 25 years of PESA. It's quite interesting, the state level analysis that has come out on the laws, which for absence of time I won't get into, but just to flag that we'll be releasing that report on the 19th. Rakshita, we just step back a bit from the specifics to the broader question of accountability. What kind of transparency regime should we ideally have? How do you bring the question of commons into both at the state level or a national level, either through a policy instrument or through legislation, into a framework that lends itself to greater transparency and accountability? This is one of the things that Safar has been looking at. So just 5-7 minutes on that, if you can.
So the report was very clear in articulating that we're at a situation where the court's interpretation of accountability of the commons is limited to eviction of encroachers. And we're also seeing that the majority of the conflicts over land is over commons. And it's also been articulated in the report that that's because there's been a lack of a clear governance framework over the commons. So clearly there's a problem, and where do we go from here? And I think that traditionally our understanding of what kind of transparency and accountability aids access of people to their own rights is something that has been fleshed out very clearly in instances when citizens are approaching the state for service delivery and governance. It's between an interface between a citizen and a state to access the rights is where India has actually shown the way for institutionalized mechanisms of what kind of information should be in the public domain, how do people audit, what kind of grievance redress mechanisms need to exist. But I think when we look at the interface between people and the commons, it's a whole different paradigm. And I think we need to acknowledge that what could have worked elsewhere can't just be simply transposed here. It's an absolutely different paradigm. It needs very creative thinking, and it requires fleshing out tenets of democratic governance, which, to be honest, after the 73rd and 74th Amendment, no breakthrough has been made of what democratic governance can actually look like on the ground. So here it's not a direct response, Biraj, of what kind of transparency will facilitate people staking their claim over commons, but more like cautionary principles of what kind of an accountability framework needs to be conceptualized and driven on the ground vis-a-vis the commons. It has to be something that is from the point of view of the most marginalized. So the Dalits, the homeless, the nomadic communities, people who rely most on the commons. How can they be empowered the most? I mean, whoever is losing the most out of displacement of commons, how can they be empowered to ask questions to the ones who are gaining the most? We also need a framework of accountability that can enforce the act of commoning, because commoning is an assertion. You assert your right to a common. It's claimed. It's not just given or legislated. And here is something that I do. I mean, coming from being deeply associated with campaigns that have fought for laws like RTI, NREJ, and now the accountability law, it's a difficult admission to make sometimes the law is not the solution. We are seeing that much of the regulatory governance framework uh, that governs the use of commons is actually in design threatening the conceptions of commons. So whether it's forest, whether it's water, we're seeing that the law itself is actually limiting of how people identify, use, protect commons in multiple ways. So it's not a question of just using existing provisions and just make what's happening more transparent and get more people to audit the existing implementation. There's something extremely wrong in the existing framework of accountability. And I think that one particular thing is also that if we are to say that just even if we just build upon the constitutional provisions of 39B, which say that commons have to be used for the public good and the state holds these resources in trusteeship, we need day-to-day mechanisms that can enforce this trusteeship. And it can't be the paradigm of property rights that will give us the solution of accountability. It's actually what will enable people to protect, use the commons without having to stake their claim on it as a case of property. But that in itself, we've been shown again and again that for marginalized communities, property, the rights to property of commons is so essential, because when it's not owned by anyone, we know in a society like India who it's going to be used by. We know it's only going to be used by the dominant class, politically or socially. So I think these are questions that it's not just what can be more transparent, but what are the facets of accountability that need to be looked at to give people the power to assert their right and to enable them to comment as an exercise. And I think just one additional thing, just not directly in response, but the last thing I do want to say about the reports, the series of reports that LCW have launched, I think it's tremendously useful. These kinds of conversations are tremendously useful, but I also think that we should perhaps try and make an effort, perhaps a mirror kind of a consultation or workshop with movements, civil society groups who are actually standing as part. I mean, these are the people who are asserting and who are on the ground and are the face of the conflict. So what kind of research questions need to be addressed in a way that helps them fight their cause? So it's a constituency. I think that these reports also ought to be helping. So what kind of research can facilitate action while, like I'll take from what Usha said, while being positively biased but still being impartial is a possibility. And I think we should do more of those conversations.
I think that's a key takeaway for us, Rakshita. Thank you for raising that. I think a suggestion to LCW would also be to translate the reports more widely, and possibly think of convening community consultations around some of these issues so that we can get the research questions that would help the communities, as Rakshita said, who are struggling on this on a day-to-day basis. Pranab, I want to come to you with a more forward-looking question. You know, we're looking at the problems and we're looking at some potential pathways. But while we see there's a lot of work around forested areas, and there is a framework of governance, however imperfect, around forested areas, we don't have such a framework for non-forested commons. You know, this is a big gap. It's just not there. So what do you think is the way forward for governance on non-forested commons? What do you think are the significant moves that have happened in the last few years which give you hope? And if we were to have such a framework, what would that be before the idea of the non-forested common disappears both on the ground and in our imagination? Can we do something about it?
Thanks, Biraj, and thank LCW for inviting me, and thanks for raising this question. I was expecting this one. Honestly, hope is very less. And why so? Let me see commons. Why there is more conflicts around commons in LCW database, and why also I don't exactly agree with Jakbal Singh that decision. Because see, land, though commons is for community, but it is more contested space, and there is a reason behind this. If you look at definition of commons, there is no definition of commons in land administration paradigm. When NSSO took up 2008 survey around commons, they didn't find any definition. So they took their own definition. If you look at commons in the land administration or land tenure lens from where I come from, there is government land, there is public land, there is no common land per se. Why say, no, let me tell you, in colonial administration, when they look at land, they look at land from a revenue perspective from agricultural land. So all other land they declared as a kind of government wasteland or government land. They didn't survey those land. They were parambaks, even they were the area Swamitva Prithviraj is talking about in many states, not in all states, they didn't survey the village land also. These parambaks and other kind of land, they remain. So when the state got independent, they started some kind of surveying, but then there was a big issues around that. For example, in Orissa, they could not survey land beyond 10 degrees slope because they didn't have instruments like theodolite, Dunphy level. They went for plane table chain survey. They didn't survey land above 10 degrees slope. And because they want to assume that others are plain, and Orissa 60% land are hilly and undulating land. So what happened? Overnight, all this land become common land or government land or public land. So, and in this land, these tribals were cultivating, shifting cultivation on which Kudki Patta was given by some kings. So all these lands became suddenly government land and these people became encroacher. So now if you evict them, you are doing again another historical injustice. So while this remains so, over 1960 land reform till 90, the objective of state was to settle these lands in favor of encroachers. So if you look at most state land laws, State Land Reform Act, Government Land Settlement Act, Encroachment Acts of the states, you find land is a state subject, and they wanted to settle this land in favor of the poor, favor of scheduled tribes, favor of Dalits, favor of women. And a lot of joint titling, lot of initiatives have taken up in Orissa. They have given usufruct right called the Dafayati Patta. That trend continued. So commons was more used for, so-called commons were used for giving the land to poor. At the same time, also a lot of commons were given for agriculture and industry. Most displacements, if you look at Walter Fernandez study, most common land have been also given to industry. Post 1990, suddenly things changed. So this common land became the land banks. So if you look at all the land banks that states have formed, they are coming from this common land. So this land became land which industry can be given to industry easily, because here you don't want to give compensation, much compensation, which of course law act changed. And what I see in future now, post 2020, now this economic paradigm will change to ecological paradigm. With net zero coming in, nature-based solution coming in, restoration coming in, carbon coming in, renewable energy coming in, the commons will be new ground for ecological restoration, new ground for this investment. Because these rights are not very clearly defined here, and state can very easily give that. So that makes me think like, how the future is going to be unless we address those kind of things. If you look at why it is happening so, the understanding of commons, actually it is like a elephant and blind man story. If you look at judiciary, it is interpretive. So they interpret what you tell them. If you look at NGOs, I have seen many NGOs in central Indian tribal belt use common for agriculture during off-season, going for pulses and millet cultivation because they want poor to benefit out of that. So government looks at it as a wasteland, I think we have already discussed. Industry looks at it as unproductive land. Urban planners look at it as vacant land. So all of them, they look at it very differently. Whereas I think to some extent Nikita was telling it, for Dongriya Kandhaj it is a cultural commons. If you look at another thing, this commons also has a multiple dynamics. They changes in a spatial temporal trend. Just to give you an example, if you look at rain-fed area, in rain-fed area, farmers cultivate the land only during Kharif season. After that, it becomes a de facto commons. You can graze this land, you can play cricket match on this land, you can even harvest water paddy. So the common is a very, if you go to northeast, this is shifting cultivation now, fallow land, it is common land. So this dynamism is there, the way it's commons interpreted. I think that is something also we need to look at when you look at this data. Can we superimpose the data on typology of commons? Because if you look at typology of commons in many states, there are 4 typologies. One is culturable wasteland, unculturable wasteland. I am talking about the non-forest common. Then there is a community land and there is a reserve land. So these are the 4 typologies, and these lands have different dynamics. And within that there is gochar. Like every village should have around 3 to 5% of land defined as pasture. States vary. Overall, I think in India it is 3.3 or 4%. There is, so we have to understand these dynamics around commons, how commons are classified, how states interpret these commons, and that will, I think, give us more nuanced understanding. How when you map this. Next layer is that when you go beyond, from this study, I think there is very interesting understanding. I was speaking to both Nitin and Kumar. See, when you look at the type of conflict coming in, so we have in the overall database, we are seeing more conflict around infrastructure. Next is power. I think let us now make power as energy, because the energy sector is coming up. So I see in future there will be more conflict around commons, around energy, around carbon. Carbon has started. So how we use this data and nuance it with this underground layers, this state layers of different typology of commons, and how these local tenure regimes, be it in Northeast, be it in Renford India operates, local tenure regime and administration layering, then superimpose this data and then probably recommend and see how things are going to change in future. I think that way we may have some hope. Otherwise, commons are really, this is the next land grab in India will be around commons. Like the way it happened in 2008 in Africa, the next land grab in India is going to be around commons. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you. And it's ironic that this land grab is going to go in the name of climate mitigation, much in the same way that the earlier generation of land grab we saw went in the name of conservation, with communities who rightfully have had those lands and usufructus rights or community rights being now dispossessed. So that's the second wave of dispossession. If you have more time, I still want a positive, forward-looking message from you, because I think we must end with hope and look at some ray. So I'll take another round from all the panelists on one positive thing they feel that they find. But before that, I come to Sister Sneha. Sister, you have a very detailed discussion paper that Vincent's given. I have requested Sister Sneha to email it to you so you can circulate it to the participants. But if you were to distill from that in just over 5-7 minutes like the other panelists, when it comes to Dalit community, and as somebody who's worked on Dalit land rights and disputes, the manner in which we codify and the manner in which the state recognizes commons also becomes a part of the problem, particularly for communities who are very marginalized, voiceless, have the least say in any heterogeneous village setting. And once you codify them, those who have been living in this gray area, where they're using the commons but don't have those rights codified, the moment you codify them, the chances that they would get them either de facto or de jure reduces, leading to conflicts which we are seeing across the country with regard to Dalit communities and their control over commons. So can you tell us a bit more from the perspective of the Dalit land rights movement on what you see on the ground?
Thank you very much. I am the last one, but not the least. So we've got to speak our issue loud and clear. I haven't lost my interest. I'm here from morning 9 o'clock. But my heartfelt gratitude, first of all, to Land Conflict Watch. I'm simply overwhelmed the way you have presented the data, and not just the paper with which I came up with. You've given me ample opportunity to learn. I'm also a Supreme Court advocate, human rights activist, but you have opened many, many doors for me as a learner today. So I sat as a student with you, and my sincere gratitude for having done that great, great task today. As the question given to me, I will base my sharing on the experiences that I bring here on the floor on behalf of Dalit community. Their struggle, their voices not being heard of. First of all, also a suggestion, as I appreciate the data that has been brought in through your monitoring research organization, I pose straight a direct question to you. I do not see any data available to argue even for Dalits for the cases when it comes to demand for land. They are the landless community in the country, we know that. And what contributes to that, we know that more than 60% of the Dalits still live in rural area. and therefore majority of their livelihood is based on the land. And when I say land, it does not mean actually they are landowners, but they are not even tenants. They are not even, when I talk of land reforms, they are not actually land ceiling act if you count on to the enforced rules do not give surplus land available in the country to the deserving, the voiceless, the marginalized sections. That remains a disturbing question. It's not that we don't have land, we have the land, but why the tenancy laws again? The Dalit is known as sub-tenants. They are known as illegal tenants, which means actually they are almost landless laborers. So when they don't have land, when I say they don't have land, they are even losing the wages. When the land is taken away, it's missing land, they also lose their wages. And therefore, my critical point when we are talking, we talk of Panchami land was available for Dalits. But why it is not being distributed again, that's being snatched from their possession, and that remains a struggle. And Dalits are not met with justice till today. So who will raise that voice? I'm just posing a question, I'm answering that too. And let us look at what is the situation of Dalit when it comes to especially economic zone. The corporates coming in, from morning we are seeing the data, the dams, when it comes to 1,000 acres of land is to be taken. Either it belongs to tribals or it is supposed to be indigenous local community that has inhabited, it is the Dalits. But that is given on pittance, on peanuts. Again, no proper compensation. And therefore, most of the land grab that is taken, we know it's on tourism, development projects, petrochemical advancements, but who gets the benefit out of it? They are simply thrown out from there, forget about the compensation. And first and foremost, it's important that land is what gives dignity and identity to Dalit and to tribals. We are talking of their languages, their culture is getting distorted. It's being snatched away. So you are simply killing the community. You are just want them to be finished off, because when you take away the land, you take away their identity. So my another point that I would like to highlight is that largely when we are calling the landowners in Punjab, the farm laws that came in, I just want to look at critically on that. Who led the movement? Even though the government had to roll back to those laws, this protest was from the landowners from Punjab. And again, we know that it's Haryana and Punjab. The Dalits do not own this land, and therefore they will not surface anywhere. Therefore, they are not just out of the land laws, the benefits from it, they also do not enjoy the produce of that livelihood. And hence, they are largely losing onto the markets, their wages. And therefore, I want to bring in another aspect of it. Why land is important? It's not just agriculture. Once the agriculture land is lost, as I have told you, that Dalits have 5 acres land, they are asking for 5 people. That's a bare minimum a family should acquire just for their sustenance, for their basic amenities, for their basic needs, for their survival. It's just for their survival. And that is at stake. And then again, we know who controls the big chunk of land in each state. Okay, so it is again the dominant castes where the Dalit will be further pushed down. The second again is, I want to raise it, when they are asking for housing, people are pushed out. When they are pushed out, we said, the girl from Northeast said that I have to lose my house. Losing the house means losing your identity, your culture, your language, your very existence. So did that time that it's not happening just with the tribals, but it's happening at a large chunk with with the Dalits. And then they are losing out on land on also for burial land. Because I was Delhi Minorities Commission member, I can tell you, sitting in Delhi, where all the burial lands are taken, where are they gone? We made a study on the burial grounds and they have simply disappeared. And this land is none other with corporates. And I'm here off the track now. I am not a DMC commission member, so I can tell you there are big hotels on it and government offices are on it. And you cannot claim, the Dalits, the minorities cannot claim that land. And therefore, even if you go for thousands of litigation, where will you reach it? Because I myself was handling those cases in my own commission. So I know what it means for people. The muscle power, the laws are in its own place, but when it comes to procedure, the money, the muscle power, and then the threat to life, I like the data that will compensate here. The physical attack on 52 threats, 44 you have put in lathi charge, 37 killing, 34, and then you are saying torturing of 8 houses, 18. My question here is, who are these? Who are the human faces behind these? If you really get into to see behind these numbers, it will be none other than tribals and Dalits. That is a reality which we do not want to face it. So as I said, I have great appreciations for the data that has come in. It's a data, but then we need to put a face to it to show where we are. And I think here, when we are talking of the land rights organizations in our country, what I propose as a human rights activist, as a Dalit activist, is to have a national land policy, especially the people who are dispossessed, people who are losing end from all directions, are actually able to have at least food security, housing for themselves, burial, dignity, dignified life as a human person. We had spoke of all our laws of talking of human dignity, constitutional rights. When your very constitutional right to exist as a human being, your dignity is violated, your right to be living as a human person with dignity. Housing is a dignity. Your right to exist in that your own place with your own language. The definition of International Minorities Community is safeguard any species that is getting extinguished, that does not get attention from the local state, they are a danger. So state is supposed to safeguard that language, that species, and that specificity of that particular group. I think that is getting lost somewhere when the tribal and the Dalit community is losing its very identity. That's where I want to enforce that your very essence of your constitutional right to be living as human person is under threat. And therefore, my conclusion to our question, how do we do it? I think we as a land right activist need to come up with solutions which provides food sovereignty and food security for all, irrespective of who you are and where you come from. And what we need to come forward as LCW also, you are at a very critical stage, and we are asked to look at the conflict of the government policies that simply can come and barge into any home, any village, anyone's property and say that it belongs to me, and you can be staying there for 10 generations and you can be simply thrown out overnight because you do not have claim over it, because you do not have possessed documents. And we know very well that people from tribals, from Dalit community, even if they have cleared the jungles, they have been indigenous community, they will never have the documents. So this remains a question for all of us, for government policy to come out with individuals when we are talking of community owning assets, common assets being safeguarded. I think it's not just the forest, it's the home of every child born in this country needs to be safeguarded, especially here I say, let us join hands and safeguard the Dalits who have lost their labor and their wages. And I can tell you and discuss hundreds of rape cases of Dalits and tribals, because they are not cases just of rape of women, but they are conflict of the land. It somewhere began with land conflict, and it ended up that women and children have to pay with the rapes. I'm doing those cases in High Court and Supreme Court. So I'm talking with the data, not just in the air. So this is the gravity of where we are talking of, and therefore we as where people become migrants, people lose their identity, they lose their very dignity as human beings. That is at stake. Therefore, all of us put together, I think we are interested group, passionate group, not just to bring out. LCW has brought in a lot of research, but a lot more needs to be done in today with collective effort to give dignified face to our brothers and sisters and to Dalit community whom I am representing today here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Sneha, for reminding us of this tragic reality that the bodies of women are the sites of conflict for Dalit and Adivasi communities across India, and violence against women. The contestation that we have today is really tragic. But I also like the fact that you've spoken about the need for a national land policy, and perhaps a national land policy that focuses on the marginalized, on Dalits and Adivasis, as one suggestion moving forward that we can advocate, and perhaps as something that LCW can convene around the next round of consultations with other organizations, particularly the community-based groups on. I want to move to all the other panelists now. I'll do the reverse order. I'll start with Pranab and then to Rakshita and others. Just reflecting on the way forward. If you had to make a few suggestions, I know I really don't like this system of moderators and chairs saying, give me 3 points, because obviously these issues are way too complex. You can't do it I hate the bullet pointization of our very complex problems, but I do feel that in today's age we do need hope. We do need a way forward. We do need pointers for how we're going to take the struggle ahead. So if there were a few suggestions that you would have, what would they be?
I think there is one concrete suggestion, and it is also based on your work. I think the decentralization of commons governance to panchayats is a solution. If you look at even Northeast India, if you look at village councils, village authorities, even there is elite capture within them, but still 70%, more than 70% forest cover is intact. Still, if you go to the villagers, poverty is not that, the Gini coefficient is not that high. So that way, I think a decentralization of commons governance to the panchayats can provide a solution. PISA has already provided a framework, but we can go beyond PISA areas also. States like Rajasthan has to some extent given an autonomy to panchayats to deal with public land. Karnataka has a public land development board that have to centralize it, but some states have given some kind of right, like in Orissa, this public, this ponds and others in some other states. So there is some kind of space available, but I think that space can be expanded, and that space will really give these communities, like Tushar was telling, post Forest Right Act, how communities in Mandalekha and others are also economically gaining. I think when this carbon and this renewable energy market is coming up, while this will provide more space for prior informed consent and whether they agree to participate in this or not. At the same time, if they participate, they'll have better control on the market, and the greater return can go to the community. Just before I end, I just want to add to what Sister Sneha was telling. I have some statistics from Thomas Piketty's lab, which talks about a Dalit population. A Dalit population grows by 1%. It is based on socio-economic caste census data. In a village, the Gini coefficient increases by 0.1%. So that means where Dalits are there, the land inequity is very high. I think that would be the reason why Ambedkar, our framer of constitution, while he was activist in Maharashtra, was asking to claim the commons. So he started a movement to claim the commons. I think this is very important. Thank you.
Thanks, Pranab. Rakshita, since I know you the longest, and for many, many years now, can we take a commitment from you that in your struggle for getting the accountability law passed by states in the center, can commons and the issue of accountability of commons that we spoke about, can that also be one of the central pillars? And would you have a few concrete suggestions on how to make it a central pillar, and how does one influence you to get it done?
Influenced and sold already, and I'm part of a very large collective of organizations and networks which are advocating for this accountability law. But I think, of course, one concrete suggestion in terms of going way forward is just this: even if you have to take this idea of take governance of commons to the people, I think what we essentially also need are forums of dialogue just between people who are at the front line of this kind of conflict. So dialogic forums with networks, civil society organizations, lawyers, academics to come together, and because I think the only time we're able to come together is when there is an amendment that's being thrusted down people's throats, there is a very regressive judgment. We sort of come together in a very reactive environment to be able to respond to a fire that's burning. But I think if we can actually sustain, if organizations can come together and sustain a process of dialogue on what kind of accountability is required that will enable the act of commoning, so that we can actually arise at a situation where where a policy of accountability is also informed by practice. It's not theory informing practice, but actually practice informing policy and theory. And I think that such a beginning has been made, and I think if more and more organizations are a part of that, and so that we're not just asking for accountability of the commons as a demand, but we also know what it entails in terms of its nuts and bolts. And to be honest, I don't think as a community we are ready yet with specific provisions, processes, platforms, methods, which we know years of work on Narega, Public Works, NFSA took about 15, 18 years to demonstrate an alternative of what people-centered accountability would look like. I think we need that kind of an alternative thought through and demonstrate.
Thank you for throwing the challenge back at us. And I couldn't agree more with you, because one is also part of some of these forums with you. I can say that one part of the challenge, which is the convening part, is something certainly that the National Foundation for India will take up as an outcome of this. So thank you again for reminding us of the need for these dialogic forums of affected communities. Tushar?
One of the things that we as Forest Rights Collective, we are trying to do, and something I would like to suggest, is that last so many years we see the space for positive law, emancipatory law shrinking in, as we discussed, in courts and in policy process. But at the ground level, there are very interesting experimentations which are going on at the Gram Sabhas. Like, we talked about how Gram Sabhas are claiming community forest resource right, asserting rights, taking control over employment. But in addition to that, what is important is that Gram Sabhas now across different parts are taking position against laws like the compensatory afforestation law or mining laws by using this Forest Rights Act and PESA provisions. In a way redefining the way resource should be governed. And these are practical processes, like Gram Sabhas in thousands. They are taking resolutions against Kempa. They are taking resolutions against forceful evictions, and all by using spaces under the Forest Rights Act. Now, how we understand that the way that is happening and something which is invisible, and how that space for positive law that alternative space for assertion is getting created at the ground level with thousands of gram sabhas. I think that is one space that we all need to understand, engage, talk about, write about, promote. I think that's the way forward. And the same learnings are also important to extend that idea to other commons from where Adivasis and Dalit are either getting displaced or their rights are getting violated. So yeah, that's from my side. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And I think documenting some of these innovations is, or what's happening at the Gram Sabha level, perhaps is the next task that we can request LCW for the reports 2023-24. Nikita, I want you to come in now, because again, from a broader lens, right down to what change we can be, what change we can make, and what is it that we as citizens, given the societal context we are in, push for? What would be your priorities?
So several of the speakers have spoken about the place of politics in bringing out the need for focusing on the commons and the communities, because common is, of course, totally connected to community. The communities that are associated with the commons and should be protected, celebrated for their claims on the commons, etc. And of course, the role of Gram Sabhas is crucial, but I would also like us to highlight and celebrate the very few politicians at the state level who are working on issues of the commons. And here I can think about, we recently had the Gujarat elections or the Himachal elections, and in each of those, there are politicians, who fought for MLA positions, who have advocated for rights of commons holders, particularly Dalit and Adivasi communities. And here I can think of the work of Jignesh Mevani, who has led campaigns for Dalit rights over commons, which have been encroached by richer communities for privatization for agriculture or housing. And he has actually, through long-standing political movements, been able to reclaim some of the land that, Dalit communities have used. I think there's very little political space currently for highlighting those kinds of initiatives, and I think we should be doing that. Similarly, in Himachal, where we have had movements against hydroelectric power, against dams, because that is very much about the, uncommoning of rivers and creating sort of green energy, which then goes, along the grid to perhaps urban centers and away from communities who depend on rivers, on their banks, etc. And, Pranab's point is very well taken, that the battle for commons is now entering more and more into the climate change and greening space, and there are alternatives being raised by communities, but also by very few politicians, and we should be celebrating them in whatever way possible.
So what will it's not a question of what politics permits, but what we push the politics to be. And thank you for reminding us of that. Sister Sneha, I'm going to give you the last word. Yeah. So 2 or 3 points really. I know there's a long list of things that can be done, especially for communities who've been the most dispossessed for thousands of years. But just 2 or 3 key ones, not sectorally, but from your experience, your lived experience, and also from what you faced as a lawyer and as a member of the Minorities Commission, in addition to the network's experience, just very crisply 2 or 3 points.
The data that is the data that's already available, that needs to be percolated down to the commons. As one of my suggestions is, we are talking of commons assets, so they need to be strengthened in their movement so that they take full responsibility what is happening to them. And that should remind us that if India Quit movement succeeded, it is because it came from rural population, our brothers and sisters who have the same fire and the passion. Don't forget, the real India lies with rural India, not the so-called furnished places as we are today. That's one. And I also would say that it's already with petitions for us available. But you have huge, I think, I see the number of them who are here. Researchers are also advocates, activists. So I think you got to make what people are bringing in, it needs to come into the high courts and to the Supreme Courts, bombarded, so that let the country know that this suffering of the people needs to be heard, and there cannot be no to it, because it's perseverance and patience. And as I said, that now let us build local self-governance, the panchayats, where the heart of the people lies. If we strengthen the local self-governance, I think there the women, the Dalits and the tribals come in, and when they get their seats in rotation, I think it is there where the strength lies. And then this dispossessed, voiceless, marginalized community can be strengthened, upheld, and they are worthy of being trusted. We just need to trust them. They have everything that is needed to bring out a revolution in our country.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for reminding us of this. We face the very real prospects of eviction out of this hall. So rather than have another case of conflict, I'd like to just thank all the panelists, Nikita, Rakshita, Sister Sneha, Pranab, and Tushar. Also to Anmol for a fantastic summary of the report. And thank you to the audience for their patience, where I'm sorry, I'm guilty as a chair of not getting you to ask questions. But I'm sure when we step off from the stage, Nitin will have a minute to say his vote of thanks, and then we can really interact with them. And please ask them the questions. Nikita, we'll take revenge on you next time when you're here and keep you for a longer session and discussions. So thank you very much again, and thank you to LCW and other colleagues for organizing this. Nitin?